Lucas Hale sat in the back seat of his black SUV, staring at the printed employee complaint in his hands. The words blurred together, but the accusations were clear: mistreatment, financial mismanagement, fear of retaliation. This wasn't the first troubling report about one of his cafes, but it was the first to come from this location. The very first Hale Café he had ever opened. The thought unsettled him. He built his company from the ground up, fueled by a belief in fairness, in treating employees like partners rather than cogs in a machine. Somewhere along the way, had that vision been lost? His assistant Naomi sat beside him, tablet in hand, waiting for his decision. "We could send an investigator, have corporate review the management reports," she offered, but Lucas shook his head. Reports could be altered. Employees could be coached into silence. If he wanted the truth, he had to see it for himself. By the next morning, Lucas Hale ceased to exist. In his place was Eli Carter, a man with a sparse resume, a worn-out hoodie, and a desperate need for a job. His designer watch was replaced with a cheap knockoff, and his tailored suits were abandoned in favor of thrift store jeans. As he approached the cafe's glass doors, he hesitated. It had been years since he'd worked a shift behind the counter. Years since he'd smelled the familiar blend of roasted beans and vanilla syrup, heard the hum of conversation over the hiss of steaming milk. For a moment, nostalgia settled in his chest. Then the door swung open, and the spell broke. A teenage employee, balancing a tray of pastries, nearly collided with him. "Sorry, man," the kid muttered, dark circles under his eyes. Lucas caught the door before it swung shut, stepping inside. The atmosphere was immediately off. The cafe still had the same cozy aesthetic, warm lighting, rustic wooden counters. But the energy was tense. Employees moved quickly, eyes downcast. The line was long, customers growing impatient, but no one was addressing the delay. The air, once filled with easy chatter, felt heavy with unspoken frustrations. At the counter, a woman in her mid-30s flipped through paperwork, stress evident in the tight set of her shoulders. Her caramel brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail, stray strands escaping as she rubbed her temple. Melissa Hayes, the cafe's manager. She glanced up, forcing a polite smile. "You're the new hire?" He nodded. "Eli Carter. Nice to meet you." She extended a hand, her grip firm but weary. "Melissa, we're short-handed today, so your training might be more trial by fire." "Throw me in," he said. "I learn fast." She exhaled, relieved, and led him behind the counter. The moment he stepped into the back area, the problems became obvious. Equipment that should have been replaced months ago was still in use, held together with makeshift repairs. The inventory room was poorly stocked, the supply logs a mess. Employees rushed between stations, barely keeping up. As Melissa introduced him to the team, another presence made itself known. Kyle, the assistant manager. Mid-40s, salt and pepper hair slicked back, wearing a smug expression that immediately put Lucas on edge. "Another newbie?" Kyle scoffed, looking him up and down. "Hope you can keep up." Something in the way he said it made Lucas bristle. It wasn't encouragement, it was a challenge, laced with condescension. Lucas only nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "All right, Carter," Kyle said, smirking as he tossed a stained apron his way. "Let's see if you last longer than the last guy." Lucas caught the apron midair, masking his irritation with an easy grin. Looking forward to it. For the next few hours, Lucas worked as an entry-level employee, blending into the routine. He made drinks, wiped counters, absorbed the unspoken hierarchy of the cafe. He watched how Melissa bore the weight of every mistake, every complaint, while Kyle lingered near the register, doing the bare minimum. He noticed how employees flinched when Kyle walked by, how conversations quieted when he entered the room. By midday, Lucas had seen enough to know something was very, very wrong. But he needed more. He needed proof. So he kept his head down, playing the role of Eli Carter, an outsider, an observer, a man no one would suspect was really watching. The days blurred together in a rhythm of rushed orders, overworked employees, and unspoken tension. Lucas, still buried beneath the identity of Eli Carter, moved through it all with quiet observation. He watched, he listened, and slowly, the cracks in the cafe's foundation grew more visible. The first was the exhaustion. It wasn't just the usual fatigue of baristas pulling long shifts. It was deeper, like a slow erosion of spirit. Employees dragged themselves through their tasks, avoiding eye contact with Kyle, their voices carefully neutral when he was near. No one lingered after their shifts. No one smiled unless a customer was watching. The second was the inventory. Lucas had taken note of the supply issues on his first day, but now he saw the pattern. Every week, they ran out of essentials. Bags of coffee, syrups, even milk would mysteriously be in short supply. Melissa, already overwhelmed, scrambled to make do, stretching what little they had while Kyle shrugged off every concern. "We must be getting more traffic than expected," he'd say, barely looking up from his phone. But that wasn't true. The numbers didn't add up. The cafe wasn't bustling enough to burn through supplies at the rate they were disappearing. Someone was taking. Then there was the money. Lucas had spent enough time reviewing financial reports in his real life to know when something wasn't right. The register never quite matched at the end of the day. Tips, when counted, seemed lighter than expected. The safe in the back office, Kyle's responsibility, was always locked, and any time Melissa asked to verify deposits, Kyle brushed her off with a wave of his hand. "Relax," he'd say, flashing a patronizing grin. "I've got it covered." Melissa didn't argue, but the way she clenched her fists when she thought no one was looking told Lucas everything. She knew something was wrong, but she wasn't in a position to push back. He started watching Kyle more closely, keeping track of every unnecessary break, every time he lingered near the register a little too long. Kyle was careful, but arrogance made him sloppy. A few times, Lucas caught him slipping a folded bill into his pocket while pretending to count the cash drawer. It was quick, subtle, but unmistakable. The worst part wasn't the theft. It was that Kyle had positioned himself as untouchable, and the entire cafe seemed to accept it as an unavoidable reality. Melissa carried the weight of it. She worked harder than anyone, filling in the gaps, staying late without complaint. She never snapped, never lashed out, but some nights, when she thought everyone had gone home, Lucas saw her sitting at the back table, staring blankly at an untouched cup of coffee, her fingers rubbing at her temples, as if she could knead the stress away. One night, after closing, Lucas was taking out the trash when he heard a muffled sound from the back storage room. A choked, stifled sob. He froze, torn between leaving quietly or stepping closer. The sound came again, and his decision was made for him. He moved carefully, peering around the doorframe. Melissa sat on an overturned crate, elbows braced on her knees, her face buried in her hands. A crumpled piece of paper rested on the floor beside her. The air was thick with something heavier than exhaustion, defeat. Lucas hesitated before stepping inside. "Melissa." She jolted upright, quickly wiping her eyes, forcing a weak smile that fooled no one. "Oh hey, didn't realize you were still here. Forgot to take out the last bag." He nodded toward the paper at her feet. "Everything okay?" She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix." She didn't pick up the paper, but he saw the words anyway. Final notice. A past due bill. He chose his next words carefully. "If you ever need help." "I don't." Her voice was firm, but not unkind. "But thank you." He didn't press. Instead, he walked past her, kneeling to pick up the paper. He didn't read it further, just folded it neatly and set it beside her. Their fingers brushed, and for a brief second, her guard wavered. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "It's been a rough few months. But it'll be fine." It wasn't fine. That night, Lucas sat in his car outside the cafe long after his shift ended. He thought about Melissa, about the missing money, about the way Kyle operated unchecked. He had seen enough. He had the truth. Now, he had to decide what to do with it. Lucas arrived at the cafe that morning with a sense of finality settling in his chest. The truth lay before him, undeniable, like a festering wound that had gone untreated for far too long. Kyle was stealing, and Melissa was paying the price. The employees were afraid, overworked, and beaten down by a system that should have protected them. Lucas had seen enough. Now it was time to act. The cafe was already in chaos. A morning rush had hit, and the understaffed crew scrambled to keep up. Orders piled up, customers grumbled, and the air was thick with stress. Melissa moved through it all with practiced efficiency, working faster than anyone, filling gaps where Kyle should have been. But Kyle was nowhere to be found. Lucas didn't have to look far. The man strolled in from the back, coffee in hand, lazily checking his phone. His eyes swept the cafe like a king surveying his kingdom. He made no effort to help, no attempt to fix the disaster unfolding in front of him. He just smirked, shaking his head as if he found the whole thing amusing. Lucas clenched his fists. Kyle leaned against the counter, watching as Melissa struggled to handle an impatient customer. The man at the register, red-faced and huffing, slammed his hand on the counter. "I've been waiting 15 minutes for a simple latte," he snapped. "What kind of place are you running here?" Melissa opened her mouth to respond, but Kyle beat her to it. "She's doing her best," he said, though his tone was dripping with something almost mocking. He turned to Melissa, shaking his head. "Aren't you, boss?" Melissa stiffened. Lucas saw it then, the slight flinch, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers curled against the register. The weight of months, maybe years, of unspoken exhaustion pressed down on her, and Kyle stood there, reveling in it. Something inside Lucas snapped. "That's funny," he said, stepping forward, voice calm but cutting. "I don't think I've seen you lift a finger all morning." Kyle turned, arching a brow. "Excuse me." "I said," Lucas continued, lowering his voice so only Kyle could hear, "I've been watching you. I've seen what you do. More importantly, I've seen what you don't do." Kyle scoffed. "You think you know how things work around here, new guy?" "I know exactly how things work," Lucas said, stepping closer. He lowered his voice, keeping it between them. "And I know where the missing money's been going." Kyle's smirk faltered. It was brief, just a flicker, but it was there. Lucas pressed on. "I know about the skimming, the fake shortages, the missing overtime pay." His voice was soft, deliberate, lethal. "You've been bleeding this place dry, and you thought no one would notice." Kyle's face darkened, but before he could speak, Lucas took another step forward, voice still calm. "And the worst part? You let Melissa take the fall. You watched her drown while you stood back and counted the cash." Kyle's eyes darted around, checking to see if anyone was listening. Melissa, sensing the shift in atmosphere, approached cautiously. "Everything okay?" Lucas turned to her, something in his expression stopping her mid-step. It was time. In one fluid motion, Lucas reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and hit play. The cafe fell into silence as Kyle's own voice echoed through the space. The recording was crisp, undeniable. Kyle grumbling about skimming a little off the top, joking about how Melissa's too desperate to push back. The final nail was his own laughter, the casual cruelty of it sending a ripple of shock through the staff. Kyle went pale. Melissa's hand shot to her mouth. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Kyle's mask cracked. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, forcing a laugh. "You can't prove anything." Lucas met his eyes, cold and unwavering. "I don't have to." And then, with the ease of removing an old disguise, Lucas straightened his posture, dropped the slouch, and let the weight of his true presence settle over the room. "I own this cafe." The words sliced through the air. A collective gasp rippled through the staff. The customers, some watching in curiosity, others in growing understanding, began whispering. Melissa staggered back a step, her eyes wide, her breath catching in her throat. Kyle froze. Lucas let the silence hang, let the reality of it sink into Kyle's skin like ice water. "You're fired," he said, his voice ringing through the cafe. Effective immediately. Kyle opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he looked small. Melissa was staring at Lucas, her expression unreadable. Kyle's jaw clenched, his face twisting in something ugly. "You can't just." "I can," Lucas said, voice final. "And I just did." Kyle's hands curled into fists, but he had no fight left. He glanced around, searching for support, finding none. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed out the door, shoving past customers. His departure met with silence. The moment he was gone, a weight seemed to lift from the cafe. The air shifted, a collective breath released. But Lucas wasn't finished. He turned to the staff, then to Melissa. Her eyes were still wide, her hands trembling at her sides. "I'm sorry," Lucas said, the words heavier than he expected. "For letting this happen. For not seeing it sooner." Melissa blinked. Lucas exhaled. "But I'm going to fix it." And for the first time since he'd arrived, he saw something in her eyes that had been missing for far too long. Hope. The cafe had never felt so quiet. Even with the steady hum of conversation and the rhythmic clinking of cups, there was a stillness in the air, a moment of collective realization settling over the staff. Kyle was gone. The weight of his presence, the poison he had spread through the cafe, had been ripped out at the root. But in his absence, something new took hold. Uncertainty. Melissa stood motionless behind the counter, her fingers pressed against the edge of the register as if grounding herself. The truth had unraveled too quickly, shifting the world beneath her feet. One moment, she was drowning under the pressure of a failing cafe, and the next, the man she thought was just another weary employee had shattered everything she believed about her reality. She turned to Lucas, not Eli, but Lucas Hale, the owner. The man who had walked into her cafe, watched her struggle, and said nothing until now. "You knew," she finally said, her voice quiet but edged with something unreadable. Lucas met her gaze, his expression steady. "I had to be sure." Melissa let out a breath, shaking her head. "You could have told me." "I wanted to," he admitted. "But I needed to see it from the ground level, to understand how bad it really was." He hesitated, then added, "You were carrying more than anyone should." "I see that now." A long silence stretched between them before Melissa exhaled, her shoulders loosening slightly. She still had questions, but for now, she let them rest. The rest of the staff had gathered nearby, waiting, watching. Some looked at Lucas with cautious curiosity, others with something that resembled gratitude. They had all been trapped under Kyle's thumb for so long, too afraid to push back. Now, they stood at the edge of something unfamiliar, possibility. Lucas turned to them, his voice firm but not unkind. "Things are going to change. Starting now." The words carried weight, not just as a promise, but as a declaration. And over the next few weeks, Lucas made good on it. The first thing he did was audit everything. The books, the supply chain, payroll. What he found only confirmed what he already knew. Kyle had been skimming money for months, possibly years, underreporting profits, while pocketing the difference. Employees who had worked overtime had never been properly compensated. Orders had been manipulated to create the illusion of shortages. It was worse than he expected, but fixable. The second thing he did was ensure every employee received what they were owed. Lucas personally oversaw back payments for missed wages, bonuses for those who had worked under Kyle's exploitative rule, and ensured that going forward, no one would be left in the dark about their earnings. The cafe itself underwent changes, too. Equipment was repaired, supplies were properly stocked, and policies were rewritten to reflect what the company had always claimed to stand for, but had failed to enforce. Employees were given more input in decisions, schedules were adjusted to prevent burnout, and most importantly, trust was rebuilt. Through it all, Melissa remained at the heart of the cafe. Lucas offered her a promotion, full managerial control, a raise that reflected the work she had always done, but had never been recognized for. But Melissa, to his surprise, hesitated. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted one evening after closing. The cafe was empty, the scent of roasted beans lingering in the air. Lucas leaned against the counter. "You already have been." She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "It's different now. Before, I was just," she stopped herself. "Before, I didn't have a choice. Now it feels bigger." Lucas studied her for a moment, then said, "You never should have had to carry all of this alone. But you did, and you kept this place running when no one else would step up. That says more about your leadership than any title ever could." Melissa looked away, processing. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. "Okay." It wasn't just a word. It was acceptance. In the following weeks, the cafe transformed. The tension that had once weighed it down was gone, replaced by something lighter: hope. Employees smiled more, customers noticed the shift in energy, and for the first time in a long time, the cafe felt like it belonged to the people who worked there. One afternoon, as Lucas prepared to leave the cafe, not as an undercover employee, but as its rightful owner, Melissa stopped him at the door. "You're really just going to disappear now?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Lucas smirked. "Didn't plan on it." She crossed her arms, studying him. "Good. Because if you're going to show up undercover and shake up my entire world, the least you can do is stop by for coffee once in a while." Lucas chuckled, nodding. "Deal." As he stepped outside, he took one last glance at the cafe, the place where it had all begun. It wasn't just a business. It was a home for the people inside. And this time, he wasn't going to let it fall apart.